Hi there, and welcome once again to Prices at the Pumps, SaltWire's Wednesday weekly look at all things energy related. I'm Scott Squires, pleased as always to be joined by the energy expert Dan McTeague. Dan, a couple things on the agenda to talk about today, but first things first, Atlantic Canadians want to know where prices are headed at the pumps, with adjustments being made this Thursday in Newfoundland and Labrador and the rest of the Atlantic region on Friday. Where are we headed?
Well, unexpectedly great news. We're headed down, and that will reflect what's happened in Ontario and Quebec and much of the U.S. Northeast, where we've seen gas prices drop about 4 or 5 cents a liter. So what it means in Newfoundland tomorrow is a 4-cent decrease, 3.9 to 4.1 for gasoline, and about the same for diesel, about 4 cents right on when you include the 15% HST. It would also mean heating oil will be down by about 3.8 cents a liter. So all within the 4-cent drop. And again, a reflection on what happened earlier or later last week when a false signal was given to markets that somehow the situation in the Middle East, Gaza in particular, that there would be some kind of a ceasefire. A very credible, very noted individual tweeted this, turned out to be untrue, and they deleted the tweet without explanation. Unfortunately, energy markets are extraordinarily skittish, very nervous about the US Fed. Strong job numbers in the United States is really lending support and credence to the idea that the US will not be dropping interest rates anytime soon. And by the way, of course, that means Canada as well. All that being considered, good news in the short term for consumers, and we'll see what happens for next week. If I were in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, I'd be holding off until Thursday and Friday to fill up.
And Dan, you mentioned, the geopolitical situation over the Middle East, and of course, Ukraine and Russia still, locking horns in a war over in that region as well. And we always talk about fundamentals. Maybe, again, just your thoughts on why or why not we haven't seen more of a fluctuation with the price of oil on world markets because of some of these things that are going on geopolitically.
Well, there's a lot of reasons, but I think markets are following some significantly erroneous information. Much of it, by the way, and that's not to accuse them, but the Energy Information Agency of the United States Department of Energy consistently gets it wrong. They, at the beginning of the year, said demand would be down and supply would be up. In other words, U.S. production would be up. Turns out they've had to revise that. We know in 2024, the global increase in demand will be about 1.4 million barrels a day. That's pretty significant. They got that figure wrong. And they also thought that supply would be about 500,000 barrels more than what it actually is. In other words, U.S. frackers can only go so far as producing gasoline. There's a belief that will start to fall. So having given such wild estimations, and you layer that on with the negativity over the idea that there won't be any interest rate decreases anytime soon, concerns about slowdowns in China, and even rumors of some banks in the United States under regulatory authority not being able to perform as expected. These are all over-torqued, downward pressured headlines that really have no basis in reality. What we are seeing, and I think you're seeing more and more commentary, not just from the oil industry, but from others saying, we are getting to a very dangerous position where the supply of energy, a lot of what we're seeing today that we're using today has been, discoveries made in the 1990s and the early 2000s. We're starting to run out. And unless someone is going to make some serious investments, we're going to wind up in a situation in 2024 where the supply picture is extraordinarily tight and demand continues to surge. Sooner or later, markets are going to wake up to that reality, and all the excuses and the hand wringing is simply going to be forgotten when prices skyrocket.
From my looking around the internet and social media, et cetera, I haven't seen a whole lot posted recently in regards to anything that OPEC is doing. Are they eerily quiet, or is this just normal? What are you seeing? What are your thoughts on what may or may not be happening with those OPEC nations that can have such an impact on the price of oil?
OPEC's being very disciplined. They're not producing the oil that many believe that they would. The idea that there's cheating going on and the numbers were fudged turned out to be incorrect. And this lends, credence to the idea that energy markets and some traders are playing this game of, there's no problem and everyone's going to go to electric vehicles and, you're going to have a brave new world of the just transition. OPEC is demonstrating that it is going to continue to be the swing supplier. And my bigger concern is not so much what happens with OPEC, but what happens with the United States, which is running out of steam. They cannot maintain 13 million barrels production per day. It is impossible to do that because, of course, the argument which has been made for some time is that the Americans will somehow become the logical next suppliers of the world. They can do a lot, but they can't do everything. We also know that U.S. oil is not the kind of stuff that makes the world go round with diesel. You need a heavier slate of oil. That means more Canadian oil, more Saudi Arabian oil, more Venezuelan oil. 2 of 3 of those countries have no interest in trading in the United States.
Well, you mentioned Canadian oil, and that brings me to a post that I saw from a follow that I started following recently on X, Javier Blas, the energy and commodities columnist at Bloomberg. And a recent post from him, there's a lot of talk about replacing oil and gas with renewables, wind energy, solar energy, et cetera. And this one caught my eye. And again, it's a larger conversation about what's happening in Canada with oil and gas and net zero. He says, European giant Ørsted is out with another shocker. Dividends suspended for 2023, 2024, and 2025. It exits several markets, including Norway. Slowdown in projects elsewhere and their guidance for wind installation cut by 30% for 3030. Job losses at about 800. Now, again, that's Europe. But we're seeing here in Canada pushes for these big wind farms, not the least of which is a massive project that's been announced to go offshore of my home province, Newfoundland and Labrador. When you hear the post or you read that from Javier Blas and what giant Ørsted is doing, what are your thoughts on what this could mean for Canada? I know it's Europe, but quite often it's a bellwether for what happens here. What are your thoughts?
Well, we know these products are unreliable and they are intermittent. And it's not just Ørsted. Last year, Siemens did the same thing and realized it was losing billions of dollars. Look, when you consider that most of these energy forms are not up for prime time when you need the most and are dependent solely on wind, you have to sort of ask yourself, does demand for these products, ebb and flow with, the vagaries of wind? The answer is no. A modern, advanced society needs something that's more reliable and something that can produce and something that doesn't take a lot of energy to produce itself. These windmills take thousands of tons of concrete and steel and rebar and use oil inside. So, the fantasy idea that these are somehow good for the environment, when you put them offshore, think about what it does to the marine life. Think of what it does to birds. There's a lot of downstrokes to these things. But here's the other part. If you think that a windmill turning is going to create electrolysis, which is going to create hydrogen, and you think that that's going to create the energy of the future, you have to remember for every amount of input of energy to put in this, you're only getting half the energy out. So a simple mathematical review of why these things don't work is pretty obvious. But what's kept a lot of companies producing these behemoths that no one needs and are unreliable has been your tax dollars and mine. And Europeans are learning that. Canadians are going to learn that very soon as well. Albertans certainly saw that. Thank God they had coal and some natural gas. Those windmills froze, couldn't work when they were needed most. This is Canada, and this is reality. And the sooner we become once again grounded in reality and stop being, trendy and cool and artsy fartsy about these things, I think we're going to realize that, these things are not meant to be built. They're complementary to our energy system, but they will never displace what nuclear, what hydro, what natural gas, propane, oil, and coal can do.
Which leads me to another post that I saw next from Chris Varco, a columnist with the Calgary Herald.
Yes.
And he says, quote, "This is the tipping point. Alberta business leaders want Ottawa to scrap Canada's oil and gas emissions cap. Quote, it is designed as a production cap, although it's disguised as an emission cap," end quote, says Whitecap Resources CEO Grant Fagerheim. Now, of course, with a grain of salt, these are oil and gas people saying these things. But Dan, you've been covering this sector for decades. What is this proposed cap, and why are we starting to see such a pushback from these business leaders in Alberta?
Well, the climate fantasists around Justin Trudeau, that would be Stephen Guilbeault and John Wilkinson, have decided that no other form of emission in this country is worth tackling more so than the oil and gas sector. And that's an oil and gas sector that has already demonstrated it is reducing emissions. And I'm not just talking about CO2, which of course is the giver of life, but all sorts of other pollutants, methane in particular. They have led the world, and we are leading the world in that regard. Nevertheless, the happy-go-luckies and the climate crowd actually believe that you can kill off this oil and gas sector, which would be the practical effect of reducing emissions by 2035 by 30%. It's impossible to do. No country would be crazy enough to do that, apart from the fact that no other country has a carbon tax or a series of 2 carbon taxes, a clean fuel standard on top of that, layered on top of a number of regulations. Look, this is a trendy international target that would be particularly devastating to a country like Canada that isn't just cold and relies on oil and gas, but also its revenues. Our GDP, our entire economy, 10 to 12% is oil and gas. You get rid of that, you might as well close shop and shut your country down, because there will be no finances for your hospitals or your roads. And practical reality is that they're alternative. They're driving around these little skippy EVs. Don't work in the middle of winter. We know that. And heat pumps don't work in the middle of winter. So this is a government that's spending a lot of money to try to convince us otherwise. The rest of the world is saying, are you out of your mind? We want your oil. We want your gas. Japan, Germany. And we've tried and said, well, we'll give you some hydrogen. Yeah, you won't give any hydrogen because you haven't got $50 billion on top of the money you've really wasted on building electric vehicles that no one wants and can't afford. On top of that, the country is going to go bankrupt. Let me really be emphatic about that point. If you allow fanatics who believe that CO2 is a problem to basically shut down our most lucrative industry and, of course, impact others like manufacturing and other ancillary industries that rely on the oil and gas sector, you will not see Canada financially last much more than a couple of years. And for that reason alone, I think it's time for voters and people to really wisen up here and recognize that we are being hijacked by a group of climate fanatics who have done so far significant damage to the outlook of this economy. If you don't like the oil and gas industry, I don't like them. I'm not a big fan of theirs. And I take them on every day with gas price predictions. And I've been doing so, my track record is pretty strong as a member of parliament. But if you think that Canada can last without the energy revenues that these things provide for the rest of the world potentially, and the great potential in terms of providing the world an ever-increasing demand of these products, then you're doing yourself no favor. And from an environmental point of view, Canada walks out of the business. What are you left with? Venezuela, Iran, Russia, Iraq. Are those the countries you really want to have producing oil and gas? So it's time for what I consider the need for Canadians to take their hand, put it on their head, and give it a good shake, because we need to get real about this, and we need to do so very quickly, or we're going to lose this country.
Because you spent 18 years as an MP in federal government, and you were inside the halls of Parliament, and you would obviously have an idea of what the workings are between the federal government and provincial governments. It's one thing for business leaders to say, hey, Ottawa, you need to scrap this. But what other avenues or means does a province like Alberta or other provinces have to push back against policy from the federal side that they feel is hurting them?
Well, they have the Constitution on their side. You've got 2 or 3 times now the federal government's been beat in courts on this issue, on the plastics ban, and more recently on its declaration of imposition of mandates on the provinces. And they're going to lose again on this one. This is this particular issue dealing with energy is in fact intrusion in provincial jurisdiction. The federal government seems willy-nilly. It has a 12% interest. That is to say, 12% of Canadians really think this is an important issue, and they believe this is a wedge issue for them. What's going to happen is Alberta is going to increasingly flex its muscle. It has to. It has no choice. Its back is against the wall. And you now have a fighter that's prepared to take on the left and those who've been promoting this woke nonsense. And what's likely to happen is that the first phase will be the Alberta government pulling Alberta assets out of the Canada pension plan. Now, if anybody thinks that that's small and trivial, good luck. When you lose 15 to 30% of your assets, it'll force Ontario teachers in my neck of the woods to say, we've just lost significant value in our pension system. We're not going to have much of a pension. So, you mess around with these things. It's like, you mess with the bull, you get the horn, as the expression goes. And I think Canadians are going to have to start to realize that we're in this together. What's good for Alberta is good for Canada. What's good for Ontario is good for Alberta. What's good for Atlantic Canada is good for Alberta, and vice versa. That's why we're a country. But you start pulling away at the economic threads and what makes this country viable, because you believe that the world is coming to an end, and you make weather events sound like they are, cataclysmic events in which the world is going to come to an end in the next few months. I think that's a terrible position on which to base public policy. Alberta is in the driver's seat, and it's going to continue to demonstrate that it's going to be responsible. But I got a feeling that Alberta and Saskatchewan and a good part of British Columbia are getting very fed up of this nonsense. And it's time for the Liberal NDP coalition that is so committed to destroying the country to pack up and go. Call an election.
And Dan, you mentioned Saskatchewan and BC. Strictly on your opinion, based on your time as a member of parliament in federal government, Alberta, if they, as you say, take the lead and really start to push back, is it feasible to think that other provinces in Canada will kind of join forces and get behind Alberta and kind of say, hey, we don't like some of the things federally that are infringing on our provincial rights? Is it feasible to think that it could be a parade of provinces pushing back against the federal government?
Oh, I think that's very much the case. The federal government is trying to play one region against the other, and the provinces are saying, good, we'll stand united if you won't. And provinces like Quebec are joining Alberta in a number of those cases. So, on mandates, if you're going to impose these things, you want to make sure that you have the moral authority to do it. You have the political authority to do it, both of which I don't think they have. You have to have the legal authority. And right now, the federal government is lacking in all three of those areas. I wasn't saying call an election because I was trying to be pedantical. The reality is that I think Canadians have lost confidence in this government and its ability to maintain the unity of the nation and its financial wherewithal. Affordability is out the window. Many people thought I was a little offline and offside in 2017, 2018, when I raised the specter of affordability, and everything was just fine. Everything was perfect. Fast forward several years, and my concerns about affordability are now very much right and center in the minds of most Canadians. It's really time to go back and ask Canadians what they think. I think we need a reset in our political agenda, because Canadians are suffering. And it doesn't matter what region of the country you are from. There is nobody who is objectively, realistically looking at the situation saying it's better off today than it was in 2015. This government has run its course, and unfortunately, it's also run the country into the ground.
Well, we're working our way into 2024, and it'll be interesting to see what transpires over the next 12 to 18 months. And Dan, that's why we're glad to be able to have you bring your insights to us each week here on Prices at the Pumps on SaltWire. And to that end, when you're not with us here on SaltWire, I know that folks like to reach out to you, chat with you, engage with you, and just in general see what Dan McTeague is having to say. Where can folks find you?
Well, look, president at affordableenergy.ca is my handle for people who want to email me on policy issues. Want to mix it up a little bit, Twitter, Gas Price Wizard, where I predict gas prices, but I also involve myself with the issues of the day well beyond energy, because I think it's a forum for many people to engage respectfully. But I promise to show you at least a bit of those who engage with me, the courtesy of a response. You may not like it, but at least you'll get that. You'll get it more from me than you will from some troll account that doesn't decide to give its name or its background.
You're always a good follow on X, formerly Twitter, Dan. We appreciate your time. Anything else before we wrap up here that's catching your eye that you want to bring to the fore, or shall we wrap it till next week?
Just want people to understand it's now moving into the latter part of February, and I think we're going to start to see energy markets move in a very different direction than we've seen over the past year. I think the trigger moment has already taken place. Geopolitical tensions are there. Economic demand is starting to surge, and supply is starting to weaken. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to get more expensive as we head towards the day in which the federal government increases price of energy with more carbon taxes on April 1st.
Well, Dan, we thank you for this week. Enjoy the rest of your week. Have a great weekend, and Let's reconvene and we'll do this all again next Wednesday. How's that sound?
That sounds great, Scott. Good to be here in SaltWire with you.
Always wonderful to have you. Thank you, Dan.